It's official. Todd Blanche, Trump's nominee as Attorney General, the anti-weaponization fund he has defended, faces a congressional wrecking ball foreshadowing possibly a rocky confirmation fight. President Trump pours hundreds of millions into coal-fired power plants and coal mining. Why? Who benefits? What about the environmental risks? West Virginia Republican Governor Patrick Morrisey, fresh from the Trump announcement, joins us. Elite colleges are returning to standardized tests, SAT, ACT. Without them, professors say incoming students have needed time-consuming remedial math education. We take a look at all this. Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to the Takeout. We love facts, and we love words here. As such, we play games with neither. What I'm about to do is not a word game. Todd Blanche, the acting Attorney General, will be nominated Attorney General. Blanche is a surname. It is also a verb, an instructive one in this particular moment of President Trump's second term. As a transitive verb, Blanche means to take the color out of or to bleach, possibly with the use of scalding hot water. As an intransitive verb, Blanche means to go pale with shock or dismay, or to simply recoil from something upsetting. Within the Senate Republican Conference, where Todd Blanche's confirmation fate will reside, there was a bit of blanching today, transitive and intransitive. When asked if Blanche would be confirmed, Senate Majority Leader John Thune gave this tepid response, and I quote, "Hard to say. This is an environment where nothing is a safe or sure bet." North Carolina Republican Senator Thom Tillis is skeptical of Blanche's confirmation. Texas Senator John Cornyn said, according to CNN, that he's withholding judgment. Both sit on the Judiciary Committee, Blanche's first stop in the confirmation process. Tillis, by the way, is the leading GOP antagonist to the so-called anti-weaponization fund that Blanche has routinely defended. Blanche was also blamed just last week by former Attorney General Pam Bondi for all the redaction mistakes in the release of the Epstein files. He is also responsible for reanimating a federal case against former FBI Director James Comey over an array of seashells on a North Carolina beach. Blanche, therefore, has appeared to relish putting into judicial motion the president's vow to seek retribution against perceived enemies. Therein lies the blanching reaction to Blanche. The first instinct among some Senate Republicans, possibly enough to jeopardize his confirmation, is to recoil, to grow pale. Blanche, to be fair, it's worth noting, has also intensified federal efforts to prosecute misuse and fraud within government programs. He was in Ohio today with an array of senior Trump officials to announce arrests there and a $30 million scheme of the alleged theft of Medicaid funds meant for children's health services. And it was at this event, Blanche said he was, quote, honored and humbled to be nominated. Picking up the story from there, Nancy Cordes at the White House. But just as I say that, Nancy, first we have to start with something President Trump just said about someone he nominated or suggested he would nominate earlier this week to a key intelligence position. His name is Bill Pulte. What's the latest?
That's right. Bill Pulte is his choice for Director of National Intelligence, Major. And Pulte was a very controversial pick among Democrats and Republicans alike because he does not have an intelligence background. And Republicans have made it clear that his confirmation process, if Trump makes him the permanent Director of National Intelligence, Trump just named him to be acting director, that it would not be a cakewalk for him. And they were very confused openly, publicly, about why Trump would name someone to such a sensitive position, such a major management position as well, overseeing the entire intelligence community, if he didn't have any intelligence background to speak of.
And so the president said that's not going to go forward as originally described. Do I have that about right?
If he said that, a Major, then you caught it and I did not, because he was answering a lot of questions in that Oval Office event, including a few just as he was going out the door. So I did hear him say that he was going to be nominating Todd Blanche to be Attorney General. And if you picked up on him saying that he was not going to move forward with Bill Pulte's position, naming him the acting director of national intelligence, it would not at all surprise me because he got so much immediate blowback from Republicans on Capitol Hill.
The phraseology is it would not be permanent from the president's mouth, meaning it would not go forward in a formal confirmation process. So, Nancy, pick up on Todd Blanche and the White House perspective there.
Sure. And so part of the reason that the president might not want to go forward with Bill Pulte is because he's got to save all of his political capital right now for Todd Blanche, who is not necessarily going to face an easy breezy confirmation process either. Republicans are still incensed over the $1.8 billion weaponization fund that Blanche announced as part of this settlement between Trump and the IRS, money that it appears would have gone to people who claim that they were wronged by the federal government, including potentially people who rioted and stormed the Capitol on January 6th. Republicans made it very clear in a heated closed-door meeting with Blanche that they did not like the idea of this fund at all, that they were blindsided. This week, Blanche announced that they were going to be pulling away, that they would be backing away from the fund, that it would not go forward. But then just yesterday, Major, President Trump was asked about it, and he said, well, I don't know. I'll have to check with the lawyers. I thought that the anti-weaponization fund was a beautiful thing. And so now you've got a pivotal key Republican in the Senate, Tom Tillis, sits on the Judiciary Committee saying that the right hand has to talk to the left, and he wants more assurances that this anti-weaponization fund is not ever going to be resurrected before he decides how he is going to vote on Todd Blanche for Attorney General.
With all the details, as always, Nancy Cordes, North Lawn of the White House, thank you very much. The Senate rejected a Democratic-drafted amendment today to permanently block what Nancy was just talking about, that so-called anti-weaponization fund. This was the start of the Senate's marathon vote session about underlying legislation sometimes referred to as a vote-a-rama. Our Nicole Killian joins me now from Capitol Hill. So, Nicole, we're going to talk about two things. Catch us up on what's going on in the Senate, and then there's a New York Times story that just broke about a half an hour ago about Graham Platner, the potential Democratic Senate nominee in Maine. Let's get to the Senate first, and we'll pick up the Graham Platner story.
Yes, because those are two very different and distinct stories,
very different.
For sure. But look, just to pick up where Nancy left off, you know, obviously we are in the midst of this voting marathon over immigration enforcement funding, a $70 billion package to fund ICE and Border Patrol. But as you know, with these pieces of reconciliation legislation, oftentimes there are these voting marathons where senators can add different amendments. And so there have been several attempts to try to block or kill this anti-weaponization fund, or in some cases divert funding to other sources. But so far, those efforts by both Democrats and Republicans have been unsuccessful. So that being said, you know, as of now, Senate Republicans are really trying to take Todd Blanche's word that this fund will not proceed, is not going anywhere. But certainly there are still a lot of concerns on the part of many Democrats, especially based on the president's recent comments that this thing could be resurrected. Now, to pivot to what we are now learning from the New York Times sat down with a number of women who have dated Maine Senate candidate Graham Platner over the years. And while some accounts from these women describe him as a caring partner, there are other women who describe a more toxic and volatile relationship with him. And this is significant because this comes on the heels of this so-called sexting scandal, if you will, involving Platner, where just recently we learned that he allegedly was sending text messages that were sexual in nature to a number of different women while he was married. In fact, it was his own wife who flagged some of these text messages to his campaign at the outset, right as he was beginning to run. And now his wife continues to stand by him. And so now these latest accounts kind of give us additional context and a fuller picture of the nature of some of his previous relationships with women. But what is troubling by some accounts is that at least one woman in this article describes some instances with Platner that she believes were physically threatening. For instance, she describes an episode where he put his hands on her shoulder and kind of grabbed her very hard. And again, while she didn't go so far as to claim it was abuse, she did talk about the fact that it hurt, that it bothered her, that, again, they had a very volatile relationship. So we are waiting to see what Graham Platner and his campaign have to say about this. They did push back on some of these accounts in the New York Times. I did a short time ago speak with Maine Senator Angus King, who told me that he did not want to comment on this, but he has seen these stories. Of course, earlier this week, Platner was here in Washington, where he met with a number of Democratic senators. Many of them emerged from that meeting still in support of him, believing that his personal affairs shouldn't be used to judge him, that people should focus on his platform when it comes to helping working families. We also know that leader Chuck Schumer met with Graham Platner earlier this week, but he declined to say anything about this meeting, only saying that Democrats will beat Susan Collins this fall. Major.
Worth noting, the primary is next Tuesday. Her campaign suspended, but still on the ballot. Sitting Governor Janet Mills. Nicole Killing with all of those details. Thank you very much. Let's go back to that anti-weaponization fund. Earlier, I spoke to Maryland Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin about that and related issues. Please listen. Congressman, on the so-called anti-weaponization fund, the acting attorney general said this week to Congress it will not go forward. However, do you believe Congress must do something legislatively to stop it? And do you believe it has a mind to do so?
Yes, we need to stop it because the president obviously changes his mind from day to day, if not hour to hour. And we need to make it very clear that the institution that's got the power of the purse, which is the Congress, forbids any use of money for these purposes. So we got to shut down that fund, and then we have to shut down the flow of money to through the judgment fund for any of these purposes, to give to January 6 rioters and insurrectionists, to give to the president or his family, or to use for any of these purposes outside of the law. So that's the very beginning of what we need to do.
In the conversations on the House floor, do you believe Republicans are inclined to join that effort?
Well, certainly a number of senators on the Republican side have spoken out against it. We know there are several Republican members on the House side who are very troubled by it, including Thomas Massie, who might feel liberated to be even more articulate in defense of the Constitution against the president these days after his election. And we know that there are several others out there. So we think that if we have any fair opportunity to vote on it, there will be a strong bipartisan majority rejecting this political slush fund, which violates about a half a dozen different provisions in the Constitution, right? It gives money to the president when he's not allowed to accept any money beyond his official salary. It usurps the lawmaking power and the appropriations power of the Congress. It turns the executive branch and the Department of Justice into something like a court deciding specific cases and controversies. The language is totally vague, and so on. So there's really nothing lawful about it, and Congress does need to act.
Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, has proposed an alternative, and I'll read it to you. We create a weaponization fund that will be available to those who can prove their claim against the federal government through the Federal Tort Claims Act, 1946 legislation. Do you believe that is in any way valid?
Well, I've got a similar proposal, but it actually is based on the law. And our proposal is that if the government of the United States violates anybody's constitutional rights, then anybody can go to court and prove that. Weaponization, they have never defined and is not a federal or a state crime. Lawfare, again, is not defined anywhere and is not a federal or state crime. So that's just meaningless. They're saying they want a slush fund to give to the people that they think the government has been weaponized against. Obviously, somebody like James Comey or Letitia James or the families of Renee Good and Alex Preddy feel like the U.S. government was weaponized against them. But that's just rhetorical. We're talking about real crimes. Now, murder is a crime. If the government kills you and deprives you of your right to life, that is a deprivation of due process. And so the families of Alex Preddy and Renee Good should be able to go to court and prove that their constitutional rights have been violated, as should any American. But we don't need a special fund run out of the White House or the Department of Justice. We just need the rule of law. And so it's amazing to me the way that they confound people with their different rhetorical devices.
Let's go to the underlying settlement that set this so-called anti-weaponization fund in motion, the settlement with the IRS. Do you believe that is legally defensible? Do you believe courts will accept it? You've called it a super pardon for the president, his businesses, and his family. Or can and will Congress step in to eradicate or limit that?
We have legislation to stop that, too. And no, it's not remotely lawful because the settlement was collusive. There obviously was no.
What do you mean by that? When you say collusive, what do you mean?
It means there was no adversary posture between Donald Trump, the plaintiff, claiming that his rights were violated, and Donald Trump, the president of the United States, who he's suing. It's basically Trump versus Trump. But Trump is going up against his handpicked attorney general, who used to be his private criminal defense lawyer. It's hard to imagine a situation of less adversary, less oppositional frame going into litigation like that. And that's why the judge in Florida took the case back and said, I want oral argument and briefing about whether or not this was a fraud on the court and therefore a fraud in the country. And just like the litigation was a fraud, the settlement was a fraud. There was nothing to Donald Trump's lawsuit against the IRS. In fact, the IRS lawyers themselves said this came several months too late. It's totally outside the statute of limitations. And when you get to the merits of it, the substance, the IRS had already taken the position in other cases on the exact same issue that the U.S. government is not liable to pay for the actions of third-party government contractors that the government's not aware of. So they'd already taken a position differently, but then suddenly they want to settle for $1.776 billion. And then what you reference, Major, which is this get-out-of-jail-free card for Donald Trump, his family, and all of their businesses for all time related to any crimes or any other civil transgressions they may have committed up until now.
You mentioned the word lawfare. That's also a website in which a lot of research about legal matters in this country occurs. And I came across something that said this, and I want to read it to you. At least 97 of the more than 1,500 individuals granted clemency by President Trump for their roles in the January 6th Capitol riot have been arrested for, charged with, or convicted of crimes separate from January 6th since their participation in the January 6th riot. 5 recipients of presidential clemency were arrested in connection with conduct that occurred, at least in part, subsequent to Trump's freeing them from prison. How do you react to these numbers?
Well, it's outrageous and it's entirely predictable because he pardoned en masse, more than 1,500 people without looking at whether they'd shown any rehabilitation, any contrition, whether they were ready to go back to society, including, people who engaged in violence against our police officers, who injured, wounded, hospitalized, and in some cases permanently disabled our police officers. And he just said, everybody goes free. Well, in that midst, we could go one by one, but take one guy, Andrew Paul Johnson, who was literally let out of jail by Donald Trump. He gets out and then he goes and within a matter of weeks sexually assaults and abuses a 12-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl. And then when they were obviously screaming and hysterical and they were, going to go and tell their families and call the police, he said, no, you can't tell anybody. I'm going to get $1 million from the president or more, and I'll be able to share the money with you and your families if you don't turn me in, which of course they ignored, and they went, and that guy is now back in jail for life. But meantime, these kids' lives have been irreversibly affected because of this mass pardon. Before Trump came along, every other president had followed the recommendations of the pardon attorney, who would look specifically at the applications and see whether the person had made progress in jail, whether they had paid their fines, whether they had, paid restitution, whether they had shown contrition. But he just let everybody go. And he's been doing that with these pardons, and he's pardoned people who owe more than $1.5 billion. A lot of white-collar criminals and fraudsters he's let free too. Again, this is unique among the presidents. Every other president had said, I want to see that you pay your fines back. You've paid your debt to society, but not Donald Trump. It's enough that they demonstrated loyalty to him.
Jamie Raskin, Democrat from Maryland. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Major. Great to be with you.
Sources tell CBS News that former U.S. National Security Advisor to President Trump, John Bolton, remember he was one of 4 in the first Trump term, is planning to plead guilty to mishandling classified information. As part of this plea agreement, Bolton has agreed to pay, we are told, a fine of more than $2 million. Bolton was indicted last October on 18 counts. Prosecutors alleged then that he shared sensitive government information with 2 relatives for potential use in a book that he was writing. CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson joins me now. Jessica, 18 charges, a plea agreement to 1. What, if anything, should we conclude from that?
Well, I think partly exactly that, Major, which is you're facing 18 charges and all the risks that go along with trial. And instead, what you can say is, I'm going to plead guilty to 1 count of actually retaining classified information, not even disseminating the information. I think what we see play out here is what plays out, as you know, in courtrooms throughout the country, which is most cases don't go to trial, in part because the defense knows the risks of going to trial. In this case, John Bolton faced decades in prison. Now, as a result of this plea deal, he likely faces either 0 time in probation or up to 6 years in prison. I think that has to feel, or he assumed this felt like, a safer and better bet at this point.
And if this plea agreement is authorized by the court, and there's no reason to assume it won't be, it's important to note that John Bolton is not pleading guilty to sharing, to not handing it off to any foreign nation, adversary or friendly. And for his larger life after this is all adjudicated, that matters.
It does matter, as you're exactly right to emphasize. This is about retaining classified information, mishandling classified information. It's not about that second step of what did you do with that information. And so he is obviously, they've carved out in this plea agreement essentially 1/18, although not quite, of the charges against him. And these are, I think, in some ways, much less serious charges that he's pleading guilty to.
Jessica Levinson, always a pleasure. Thank you. So to come on the Takeout, the White House border czar Tom Homan speaks with CBS News. His assessment of the conditions inside a New Jersey ICE detention facility. It's called Delaney Hall. There have been clashes and protests outside Delaney Hall with law enforcement. Plus, why some professors are begging college administrators to end the post-pandemic trend of eliminating standardized testing and their requirements. We'll tell you why when we come back a little bit later in the show. The Takeout returns in 90 seconds. Welcome back to the Takeout. In an interview with CBS News, White House border czar Tom Homan denied reports that there are inhumane conditions inside New Jersey's largest ICE detention center. Protests outside led to clashes with police outside of Delaney Hall late last week and over the weekend. Detainees inside said they have been denied food and their food has been spoiled or they've been receiving inadequate medical care. Homan, however, had a much different experience. He said he toured the facility last weekend. He spoke to CBS News immigration correspondent Camilo Montoya Galvez. Camilo, great to have you joining us from the Broadcast Center in New York. What did Holman have to say?
Hi, Major. Just to level set, this week, the New Jersey Department of Health filed a lawsuit seeking unfettered access to that Delaney Hall ICE detention center. And in that lawsuit, officials described overcrowding at the facility, lack of ventilation, unsanitary food, the unchecked spread of communicable diseases like COVID and influenza, unsanitary bathroom conditions, and potentially inadequate tuberculosis infection control practices. And we asked Borders' Tom Homan directly about this report and the allegations that have been raised by detainees and lawmakers alike. Let's take a listen.
I made an unannounced visit there on Saturday. I sat down in the cafeteria with the detainees and ate the same meal they ate. And again, was it a five-star cuisine? No, but it was spaghetti and meat sauce. It was green beans. It was charred beans. It was a butter and bread. It was fruit drinks. It was a dessert that I didn't eat, but the spaghetti was good. And I'm a pretty big guy, and I didn't finish the meal. I couldn't finish the meal. So, you know, I saw it for myself. So I think a lot of this is based on, you know, people in detention will make accusations because they don't want to be in detention. You know, and there was never a hunger strike. This whole started about people being on a hunger strike. There was never a hunger strike because the few people who didn't eat in the cafeteria were getting food from the commissary. So they were eating. So again, putting out false information because their goal is, and they've said it, the governor said it, the mayor said it, this is about shutting down that facility.
And Major Homan also denied reports of overcrowding at the facility, saying that Delaney Hall currently has the capacity to hold up to 1,000 immigrant detainees facing deportation. And he says that as of this week, it is housing 706 detainees.
Very quickly, Camilo, is the border czar or anyone there willing to allow journalists or lawmakers to go in there who have concerns about these things that are part of the lawsuit?
That's a great question, a critical question, Major. We posed that exact question to Borders' Tom Homan. We asked him directly, are you willing to let us in, CBS News and other journalists, so we can show the American public and they can make up their minds about the conditions at the facility? And he said he would have to defer that question to Homeland Security Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen. We are out to the Department of Homeland Security and had requested access to the facility last week. That has yet to be granted, Major.
Camilo Montoya Galvez from New York, thank you very, very much. Coming up, West Virginia Republican Governor Patrick Morrisey joins the show, fresh from his visit to the White House, where President Trump announced a new emergency investment in coal in America. You're watching The Takeout. Welcome back to Takeout. Welcome to the Conversation Corner. President Trump just this afternoon announced a $700 million investment in coal plants throughout the United States. It includes 2 new plants in Alaska and West Virginia, which would be the first new coal plants built in this country since 2013. West Virginia Republican Governor Patrick Morrisey is here. Welcome.
Good to be here. Thank you.
I said in the opening of the show, why and who benefits? So why and who benefits?
America needs such a diverse array of energy to compete on the international stage. We have a battle going on between China and the U.S. for energy. And China is building one coal-fired power plant after another. Coal still remains a very important part of America's energy portfolio, in particular as technology, information technology battles out. You need massive quantities of energy. West Virginia can provide that energy. We're going to do it by extending reasonable, useful life of coal-fired power plants. If you can build new coal-fired power plants, that would be great. Gas and nuclear. So that's why this is such an important announcement, because West Virginia is going to be America's battery, and we're going to basically fuel up the contest we're having worldwide for information technology supremacy.
Governor, let's talk about that energy mix, because information I have in front of me here said that coal provided 15% of energy production in our country in 2024, down from 45% in 2010. That's true. You don't dispute that.
I mean, they say 17%, but it's in that range.
It's in that range. Natural gas provides about 43% of U.S. electricity, with the rest rounded out by nuclear and renewables.
Yeah.
So coal's down. Is this about saving coal and what's left of it?
Look, I think there's going to be a real role for all of the above, for coal to still have extension of its useful life, because the power demand is insatiable. We're talking about the
You mean data centers and things for AI?
Yeah, for technology, for AI, you're going to need coal to be extended significantly. You're going to need a lot of gas. You're going to need a lot of nuclear, other forms of energy. So I think that we have to be thinking this way. So I think today is just necessary to make sure that we're doing everything we can with a variety of energy forms. And by the way, helps out West Virginia, because as we're growing and we're very ambitious in terms of our energy goals to get to 50 gigawatts of energy by 2050, coal is still going to play a big role. 12.9 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants now. That can go up a lot because it's part of the portfolio we need.
Americans, I think, when they imagine coal, they imagine a time in America when that was a very large job-generating industry.
Sure.
I've got some numbers here. I focused on January 1990 because that's when I came to Washington. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 136,100 Americans were coal miners or in the coal industry. Let's go to January 2017 when Trump was inaugurated, first term. The number was 50,800. Now, March of 2026, that number is 38,200. What does that tell you about these trajectories and the jobs available with this new investment?
Well, a couple of things. First, I served as Attorney General in West Virginia for 12 years, and for 8 of those years, I had to help lead a lot of the fights battling against the Obama administration and the Biden administration.
Because they were hostile to fossil fuels, specifically coal.
They were incredibly hostile, and they played a major role in that diminution, the numbers you're talking about. But look, the reality is we are in a new world right now, that the demand for energy is so vast that if we don't take advantage of coal, gas, nuclear, and all these forms, we're going to be in a very difficult position vis-a-vis China. And that's what worries me. They're building one coal-fired power plant after another in China. And so we'd be foolish to not be maintaining or growing not only in coal, but these other forms of energy as well, because that's who's going to win the next international fight. It's going to be who has the energy resources that are need to fuel up those fights.
And these funds are coming from an allocation through the Defense Production Act, which historically has been used for dire emergencies. What's the dire emergency, Governor?
Look, I think that if America doesn't sustain its growth in terms of not only American energy independence, but energy dominance, we're going to be in a very dire position against China. This is what worries me. When I say what keeps me up at night, I worry about the hardworking West Virginians, making sure that they have good jobs, that there's clean water. But I also look out into the future and I see what China's doing, and China's producing far more energy than the United States every single year. We can't let them get ahead. This is America's strength, and that's why coal has to be an important part of that mix.
Very quickly, I want to give you a chance to respond to what Public Citizen said about this. They're hostile to this. It said, abusing emergency authorities, that's a reference to the Defense Production Act, to justify subsidies for coal is a waste of taxpayer dollars and a clear giveaway to an absurdly outdated, expensive, and dirty fossil fuel.
Look, I mean, these are the same people that were promoting the Green New Deal and all the efforts that had actually really harmed the country. Not just in renewables, but they were hell-bent on eliminating all use of coal and natural gas. They were trying to call everything that they were doing dirty. Yet, if you look at what fueled up the fight in World War I and World War II, and what's going to fuel up the ability to fight into the future with AI and technology, coal is going to be necessary. So this is wrong-headed on their part. It's a national security concern, and people better start paying attention to it.
West Virginia Republican Governor Patrick Morrisey, I appreciate the time, Governor. Thank you. Thank you very much. The Ebola outbreak is spreading in some parts of Africa, but the head of the World Health Organization tells CBS News Americans should not be concerned. More when we come back. This is The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout. As health officials in Africa continue to work energetically to contain the spread of Ebola, the head of the World Health Organization sat down for a conversation with CBS News. Here was his response to our Ramian Asensio's question about what concerns Americans should have.
This outbreak or epidemic is actually low risk for the U.S. And that's why, the travel restrictions not necessary. I don't think Americans should really worry about this.
I want to bring in CBS News medical correspondent Dr. Celine Gounder. Quick reminder, she's an infectious disease specialist who spent time in Guinea as an Ebola aid worker during the West African epidemic. Dr. Gounder, what you just heard, do you agree with?
I think for Americans here in the United States, the risk is very low. So the way I put this sort of frame the risk, when I first heard about COVID, I was terrified. So that's back in end of December 2019, early January 2020. That had all of the makings of a pandemic, meaning worldwide. What we're seeing here is a regional epidemic in the making, which means it will likely stay in the region. And at worst, you might see some sporadic cases outside of Central and Eastern Africa, but this is not something that's going to become a pandemic.
And there was a reassessment of suspected Ebola cases, meaning the number of suspected cases has gone down inside the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but frontline medics still say they have many, many challenges remain. How should a generalist hearing those two pieces of information respond or evaluate?
They're catching up with testing. So until you can test somebody, we consider them to be a suspect on the basis of their risk factors, potentially symptoms. And then once you test them, you can clear them and say, okay, you do not have Ebola. And so that's what's happened. And that's why the number of suspected cases has gone down, because we have been able to do that testing. Now, that said, we're still really behind on controlling this. Contact tracing is now up to 45%. But that means we're still missing more than half of people who need that contact tracing and follow-up to see if they develop symptoms. And the problem is if you miss one of them and you don't isolate and treat them, each of those cases can become a new chain of transmission.
And the Secretary of State, also the National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio, was on the Hill this week. And at one point, he suggested the Trump administration is considering naming an official, maybe even a czar, to oversee the U.S. Ebola response. How do you evaluate that?
Well, this was a really important move under President Obama during the 2014-2016 West African outbreak. He appointed Ron Klain to be Ebola czar at that time. Ron, many people may remember, was also chief of staff to Biden during his presidency. Ron was somebody who understood all of the different players, the agencies involved, the consummate Washington insider. And so it really depends on who is being appointed as Ebola czar during this outbreak. Is it somebody who understands how the system works, who understands and knows all the different players and how to coordinate? That's really what this job is about.
And if that person were to be named and have that experience, what would it mean in terms of U.S. policy?
Well, I think you see better coordination among various different agencies. So right now, the State Department is actually taking lead. In the past, it was more of an HHS lead. But regardless of who's leading, you need close coordination with all the different health agencies, including the CDC, NIH, for potential research during the outbreak on vaccines and antivirals. And so I think the appointment of an Ebola czar, if it's the right person, could better help align the different agencies in a whole of government response to this.
Dr. Celine Gounder, as always, thank you. Here's a trend in higher education you might be aware of. Colleges eliminating standardized testing requirements in order to possibly level the financial and application playing field for high school graduates. But now some professors are begging administrators to reinstate those exams like SAT and ACT. We will discuss why when we come back. This is The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout. Fun fact, I applied to college in 1979, and I took the standardized tests, the SAT and the ACT, twice, both of them, because my scores were so bad, okay? That trend of standardized tests and application went on for decades, but it started to ebb a little bit before the pandemic, and it really expanded during the pandemic when, for lots of different reasons, college administrators and those reviewing applications decided there was something unequal about using standardized tests or giving them a certain weight. More than 1,300 professors at the University of California, however, recently signed a letter calling on the school, and you might say possibly begging the school to reinstate requirements for these tests for STEM applicants, writing, quote, "We now observe preparation gaps so severe that instructors must reteach middle school mathematics." Doug Belkin covers higher education for the Wall Street Journal and has written several articles about this. Doug, this caught our eye. Talk to us about this reassessment of this trend that really accelerated during the pandemic.
Yeah, this was predicted when they dropped the SAT by a lot of faculty who said that it was going to be a problem. What's happened is that grade inflation has become so problematic that it's hard to discern how prepared students are for university just by the grades. There's so many kids who have straight A averages now. The SAT and the ACT offers a benchmarked, objective exam that gives students a way to show, how prepared they will be, and it's a pretty good predictor for college performance. And without it, a lot of kids are struggling.
And Doug, remind my audience the good intentions of those who said, wait a minute, we should devalue or possibly take out of the application process these standardized test scores in the first place. What were they driving at? What were they trying to solve?
The SATs and the ACTs track with wealth, class, race, and so you end up with kids who are coming from under-resourced schools, minority school districts who don't do as well on this exam. So they're competing against kids who are coming from wealthier districts and have access to better test preparation. And so the argument was that there are some kids who just weren't getting a fair shake because they didn't have and they were bombing the test en masse. And so to get rid of it would get rid of a hurdle to get into college and get into good colleges.
You cover higher education, so you know that just because professors write a letter doesn't mean anything's going to change. Do you think this is part of a reassessment that's going to stick, meaning we will likely in a few years see standardized tests have a bounce back moment?
I do think that's likely. It's happening now. The Ivy Leagues, all except for Columbia, I think, have reintroduced the exam. Most of the folks who take a close look at this say that it is a good predictor that students who take the exam and do well on it are more likely to succeed in college. And if they don't, then they're just more likely to drop out. So giving access to kids is helpful, but if they're not finishing their education, then it doesn't really help anybody.
Quick reminder to my audience, Doug, what does STEM stand for? And I've been reading recently that there's a reassessment of even the value of STEM education in the era of emerging AI technology.
STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math. And there's a reassessment with soup to nuts on education right now because AI can do so much. Where it lands and what jobs it pushes out right now is the $64,000 question. This has become an issue with the SAT at UC because it was STEM professors who wrote the letter, and they're saying that the kids can't keep up in those classes. As a result, they can't cover as much ground, and that, as a result of that, students are graduating at a lower rate, and they're not able to get jobs in appropriate numbers in the STEM fields in California.
Very quickly, Doug, when you talk about grade inflation at the high school level, help my audience understand what you're talking about.
Everybody gets an A. About 50% of the grades in high school right now are A's or A minuses. At elite colleges, it's even higher than that. So grade inflation has made transcripts almost irrelevant.
Wish I could have gotten a piece of that action in 1979. Doug Belkin of the Wall Street Journal. Great stuff. I appreciate your time very much. Thank you. I'm still not traumatized by my college application process. I really, truly am not. Happy Thursday, everyone. This is The Takeout. Relentlessly curious, reliably civil, occasionally clever, never triggered about high school, never. The Daily Report coming your way next.